Financial planning is one of my favorite things to do with a new client. It really sets the foundation for the relationship going forward. And really, the strategies, the tax moves, the investment decisions we want to make are driven based on the financial plan. This is your financial plan, by the way. And we want to be fairly conservative in the assumptions that we make within the financial plan so that we can be very confident that in a variety of scenarios, both good and bad, you're going to have the retirement that you've always dreamed. And we don't want to have any extra risk. So, to do that, we're going to really dive into the deep end here on a few key details. A financial plan, however, is not some complicated Excel document. As much as I love spreadsheets, maybe that's my CPA background coming out. What it really is a process where you and I dive in, understand what matters most to you, your values, your goals, and then we test your financial plan in a variety of scenarios to see what we can do to improve either the tax efficiency of the plan, reduce the risk, help you reach your goals a little bit sooner, maybe provide for your kids. I'll tell you what, a lot of people are helping their children, in some cases their grandchildren, with a down payment on a home or with education. Maybe they want to help them pay for a wedding or just give them a jump start on retirement. Maybe you don't have kids. Maybe it's just you or just you and a spouse. We want to make sure that we are creating the life that best suits your goals. There's a lot of noise, a lot of distractions in the world today, in the market, on the news, on your phone. And I don't want you to get distracted from what matters most to you. And I found in doing this now hundreds of times with families all over the country, and in some instances around the world, that a financial plan is a way for you, and especially if you have a spouse, to look in the mirror and see where you're at right now clearly. I'll give it to you straight. And now we can make adjustments, tweaks, so you can get to where you want to be just a little bit sooner with a little less headache and frustrations and hopefully a little less tax along the way. So without further ado, what do you say we jump right in and you can see what that first meeting looks like when we build a financial plan. Okay, so the first question is, how long are you going to live? Now I laugh because you and I both know we don't know how long you're going to live. But for most people, we use 90 as kind of the default. We want to err on the side of being conservative as we're building the financial plan together. And while maybe your family history, nobody has lived until 90. Maybe they've passed in their 70s or maybe their early 80s. 90 is kind of a good benchmark, I think, in some scenarios. Now, if your family lives longer, then great, let's make it longer. But most of the time, we're going to leave it right there at 90 years old. Now, just one caveat among many, which we may discuss in the future, comes into play when we talk about tax planning, because if one of you passes away sooner or later than another, and you're now no longer married filing jointly, but a single tax filer, boy, that can change a lot of things, or Social Security, or when we file for a pension. So we will adjust those in future meetings and conversations. Don't worry. I recognize that in some instances, putting a later date actually is less conservative, but on the whole, we want to say, hey, we need enough assets, enough income, enough cash flow to provide for you throughout your life. And we'd hate to be aggressive or to burn through money sooner rather than later and then find that, hey, you're actually living a few years longer and maybe you need long-term care. You're diagnosed with Alzheimer's or something else, and we haven't set aside enough money for a long period of time to provide for you. So anyway, we'll leave it there at 90. We're going to do this person. I don't know what sounds fun. Let's do them in Florida. I feel like I've had a lot of new clients coming in from Florida lately. Florida starts with an F, I remember. And we're going to say they were born in 1960. Okay, here we are, Cosmo Cougar. Cosmo has a wife named Wanda, and we're going to have Wanda being born in 1965. They have a few kids. They're both grown, out of the house, independent from a financial standpoint. So I'm not going to include them here. But if you are taking care of a loved one, maybe it was a parent or a spouse. Well, a spouse is kind of unique. We'll say a parent or a child or a sibling, somebody kind of outside that immediate nucleus of a family there, then we would, potentially add those people in here because there could be a financial burden or obligation, but we're going to keep things fairly simple. Okay, so step one, we're done. We got the family set up. The second piece of the puzzle is income. Now, Cosmo just retired, but Wanda is still working, and she plans on working for about another year or so. So we're going to remove Cosmo's salary here because he just retired. Wanda, we're going to come in, and she is going to work until her retirement, which I'll show you in just a minute. We'll just be around the corner. Right now, Wanda's making about $95,000 a year. We're going to assume an annual increase of 3%. It's not going to make a huge difference. She's just working another year or two, but we'll keep that in there. Cosmo's Social Security. Now, what we do is we base it on full retirement age, which for Cosmo is going to be when he turns 67. So in this scenario, we're going to ask Cosmo, we're going to ask you, if you're a Cosmo, for a recent copy of your Social Security statement. They used to send them in the mail, if you remember, years ago, but now it's not until, if you're just a few years out from receiving Social Security, you may get it in the mail. Alternatively, you can go to ssa.gov at any age, type in some information, get verified, and then you can see exactly what the Social Security Administration has on record for you. Now, a word of caution on this. If you've never done it before, make sure you do it early in the morning when you're feeling awake, you got a nice cold drink next to you, because sometimes it can take a little while to get logged into these government websites and verified. Also, check to make sure that your earnings record is accurate and matches what the Social Security Administration has on file. Once in a while, they mess it up, and you want to catch these things early so that you're not gypped out of your Social Security benefit. For Cosmo, we're going to say that the monthly benefit that he's going to receive at his full retirement age, we're going to make it $3,400. Now, Wanda hasn't been working at making $95,000 the whole entire time. In fact, she was raising the kids at home for a while. She just recently went back to work. And she's been, I said recently, like within the last 5 or 6 years or so. So for her, she doesn't have a bunch of Social Security that she's eligible to receive, but she does have some, and she qualifies with the required number of quarters that she needs. So for her, we're really looking at about $1,400 at her full retirement age. Let me pause here and just share something interesting. There's a lot of complications to Social Security, complications in terms of the actual math that underlines how much you're going to receive. If you're married, the spousal benefit, what happens if you're of different ages when one of you files, the other one delays. Just know that each situation's unique, and that's a key piece of the financial plan. We'll look at it just kind of at a top level here in the first meeting. But if you're nearing retirement, then we're going to spend a dedicated amount of time really testing a number of scenarios and making sure that we're confident in the plan that we've decided to go with when it comes to Social Security. Maybe we'll make a separate video on another day. Right now, at first glance, it looks like Wanda's going to be filing for a spousal benefit, which means that her own benefit, $1,400, is less than half of what she would receive under Cosmo's benefit. So in that case, she would elect to take Cosmo's benefit because half of Cosmo's is greater than her own. Now, if she keeps working and makes more and something changes, okay, then we'll navigate that when the time comes for her to file. But as it stands right now, we'll put in her numbers, and the system, this really powerful financial planning tool, will calculate that in the background. If there are other sources of income, like a pension, we could add that in here. If they were sold an annuity by an old brother-in-law or something back in the day that they've held on to, we can add that here. Alimony, child support, the list goes on. We're going to keep things simple in this scenario just to kind of illustrate it. Next section is the savings section. This is where you're currently making contributions to your retirement accounts, savings, high yield savings, maybe the HSA, if you're on a qualifying high deductible health insurance plan, which is the case for Wanda, but not for Cosmo. See, Cosmo's 66. He is on Medicare. Wanda's working. She is not covered by Medicare yet because she's just 61, not yet 65. Her employer plan offers a qualifying high deductible health insurance plan, but her employer does not offer an HSA. Not to fret. Because she's under a qualified high deductible health insurance plan, and if you're wondering what high deductible is, I would tell you what that number is. I have a handy dandy sheet, or you can just do a quick Google search and find it for yourself. For her, we can open up an HSA, and I use Fidelity for me and for my clients. And so in Wanda's case, even though her employer doesn't offer an HSA, we can open one up on our own, and she can make contributions. Plus, because of her age, she can make additional catch-up contributions to the health savings account. So we're going to add that in here, the HSA, what I call the creme de la creme of investing. And for her, we're going to max it out. And this is Wanda, and it's going to go until Wanda turns 65. So Wanda's age, 65. And that's because if she does retire in the next year or two, she's still going to need health insurance. And in that case, she's likely going to shop for it on the marketplace. She's going to go to her state's website. Sometimes you may have heard of this as Obamacare or Affordable Care Act coverage. She'll shop for it. She's relatively healthy, so odds are she's going to get a bronze or silver plan. Now, the way that health insurance works, boy, that's a whole other conversation on its own. But essentially, if you are not covered by an employer-sponsored health plan and you're not on Medicare, one of the first places you go is your state's website. You type in your income, your zip code, a few other pieces of information, and then it will tell you how much you're going to pay. And if you qualify for a subsidy from the state, how much that subsidy will be. So in other words, what your monthly premium will be at the end of the day. And they have different tiers or metals: bronze, gold, silver, platinum. Generally, the higher you go in terms of the standard or the metal, the more Cadillac version, we'll say, of health insurance you get. All right. So anyway, to keep things simple, we're going to say that whether she's covered by an employer-sponsored health insurance plan or a health insurance plan before Medicare on the marketplace, it's going to be qualifying as a high deductible plan, and she's going to be able to put money aside into the HSA. Awesome. Cosmo's retired, no longer has a 401k. Wanda does. And Wanda is right now putting in a chunk of change into it. Now, she's going pre-tax at the moment, which makes sense for her in her situation. But when she does retire, boy, we're going to start the Roth conversion train, which is one of my favorite things, probably one of the most common things that retirees miss, especially early retirees in that first year of retirement. And while it may not necessarily be a Roth conversion strategy that we implement day one, it might be tax gain harvesting and taking advantage of those lower capital gains brackets, even up to 0%. And because they're married, essentially, we could recognize the same amount in salary as capital gain income from her investments in year one or year two or year three. And that allows for enormous tax efficiency. Now, that applies to investment accounts outside of 401ks and IRAs. So that would be like a brokerage account, for example, but we'll look at that in just a moment. Sometimes I get excited. I get ahead of myself once I have these conversations, but don't worry, we're going to go through it. I have a very specific order. That's maybe the CPA side of me. So for Wanda here, she's putting away 18% of her income into a 401k, and her employer is matching actually up to 4%. We can customize this a lot of different ways here. We can say a percentage is going into Roth, but for now, she's just going pre-tax 18% into her 401k. They're also saving in a joint brokerage account. They like the flexibility of, just having access to investments, potentially. Okay, here's the backstory. I'll give it to you. Part of this is a little bit of an inheritance that they received from her mother. And the second piece is some equity that Cosmo actually had way back in the day. He'd kind of been holding on to it from his employer. He eventually decided to sell it, but they continued to invest it. And this is just that in a brokerage account. They're not really actively making contributions here. So we'll just delete this one for simplicity's sake, but they do have a pretty sizable taxable brokerage account, as you'll see in just a moment. We could also add things like Roth IRAs, 529s, but like I mentioned before, their kids are pretty much independent, out of college, that's all done. But they do have a few young grandchildren. They're just a few years old. And so we've talked about setting up a 529 for the grandkids, because a 529 can convert to a Roth IRA for the grandchildren down the road when they're a little bit older. And part of what they want to do is leave a little bit of a legacy. Now, in this case, Cosmo has said, we worked, we saved, we paid for our own schooling. Like, we didn't really get much in the form of an inheritance. It was, about 50,000 or so. And we want to encourage our kids to kind of do the same thing. Whereas Wanda is much more, I don't know if giving is the right word, but she definitely wants to help out her children and especially her grandchildren. So this is that point where, as a husband and wife, I feel like I have this conversation all the time. You kind of take a step back, and I'm not going to say they go head to head, but they have real conversations about what matters most to them and the life they want to create now and in the future. We're going to skip that section for now, but this is where we add things like that. Okay, this is the net worth section. Net worth, I think, is extremely important to track. Not just because you want to know, okay, if I die today, how much am I worth? I think that there's very little value in that, but just understanding your goals, where you stand, what you're trying to achieve, and also to see where you've come from. I think that's the exciting piece, is to look back and say, wow, I was here, now I'm here. That's exciting, and that can help to influence the decisions that you make. The goal of a financial plan, I would say working with a financial planner, is not necessarily to die with the most amount of income. In fact, I'd say if that's your goal, I'm probably not the right fit for you. But the goal is to live the life that you want to live on your terms. And sometimes, in fact, I feel like more lately than not, I've actually had to tell clients, hey, you're saving too much. You're not spending enough. And let's be sure we're taking money out to do the things you want to do today. That might mean going on more trips or redoing the kitchen that your wife's been nagging you about, or whatever the case may be. Or it could be done for tax reasons. If your goal is to leave money behind to kids or grandkids, it might be more tax efficient to actually give them those assets while you're still alive instead of when you're 6 feet under. Not just because you can see the good that they can do with it. They're just saying better from a warm heart than a cold hand. So that's part of it. But also from a tax efficiency standpoint, we can save on taxes depending on the size of your assets or the size of your net worth. So here we are. We can do this a number of ways. We can link up accounts. So we can link up bank accounts and it will aggregate that data in, or we can just do it hard code, which is what we're going to do today. So we're going to come in here, and they have combined savings of about $60,000. They also have a little bit of a money market, and the money market's got about 45 grand in it. They have that in a trust account, so we'll include that there. It's the same thing for tax reasons in most scenarios. It is for them, but just so you know, there's two types of trust accounts, or trusts, I should say. We've got revocable and irrevocable. And within each, there are some nuances. But from a tax standpoint, when most of my clients set up a trust, if we're involved from, the basic ground up, or if they already have a trust from years before and we're making some changes in connection with an estate planning attorney, most of the times it's taxed the same way. So it just is flow through income. You don't need that, but if you're going to take a CPA exam, it might be helpful. But just something for you to know. I know people sometimes get nervous about trusts and how it might change things from a tax perspective. But in this situation, it's the same. In fact, the joint account has a beneficiary that's payable on death, POD, as the trust. So either way, these assets are both going to be in a trust if they both pass. So it really doesn't make a difference in their situation. They have credit cards, they pay them off every month, so I'm not going to include anything there. Okay, let's go to the investments. Let's start out with my favorite one, the health savings account. Let's see where it's at. Here it is, HSA. And we're going to put it in Wanda's name just to keep things simple. They've been putting away a chunk of money in the HSA. They've got about $40,000. And here's the crazy thing. They've only been investing for the last year or two since they watched one of my videos and read my book. There's a little shameless plug for you. So a lot of that has just been contributions over the years, but they've been investing it, and it's going to be there for them as long-term care. They don't have a long-term care insurance policy like most of you don't. It's just so expensive, the premiums relative to the benefit that you get for things like in-home care or assisted living or maybe a nursing home. But for them, the HSA we've discussed is going to be earmarked towards the end of their life. At that point, they can use it for a few things. Maybe they don't need long-term care. Great. We can go back and reimburse ourselves for prior year's medical expenses completely tax-free. So huge benefit. Plus the money inside of this is growing tax-free, which is exceptional. There's no cost basis on this. And we're going to say that they're investing it fairly aggressively. Okay. We'll save that. The next thing they have, of course, is a couple of 401ks. Now, Wanda, this is her current 401k that she's contributing to. She's got about $250,000 in there right now. And she's pretty moderate. So we're going to go moderate investment there. And by the way, the first thing we're doing here is just making sure that we're getting all the data in correctly. We're going to make tweaks and adjustments in a future meeting, but it's kind of the data gathering piece of the puzzle right here. Now, Cosmo had a 401k. He rolled it over to an IRA. In fact, he's had a few different jobs over the course of his life, and he's always just moved them into an IRA once he's quit or left the job that he's with. So we're going to come here. He's got an IRA right here. And in his IRA, he's got $1.4 million. And it's all pre-tax. Now, they do have a little bit of a Roth IRA. In fact, I should say Cosmo has a little bit of a Roth IRA. So we're going to name that right here. Not a ton. In his Roth IRA, he's got about $70,000. So, and this, let me name this 401k, Wanda 401k. All right. And then the last thing they've got is a little bit of a taxable account. Sometimes you may hear this called taxable account, brokerage account, a non-retirement investment account. There's a ton of different names, maybe a TOD or with rights of survivorship's another name. They kind of all mean the same thing. So for them, they have a joint brokerage account, just like a joint checking or a joint saving. They can put in as much money as they want in this account. They can take it out whenever they want. They have a lot of flexibility. Now, I mentioned they got a little bit of inheritance. He had some equity. It's kind of been a place that they've stocked some money aside. Not a ton of money here. They're looking at about $150,000 all told. And they have a cost basis in this of about $50,000. Cost basis is extremely important in this scenario because if I were to manage this investment account for them right out of the gate, we transfer the money over. If it's at Schwab or Vanguard, like I mentioned, I use Fidelity. They already have a Fidelity account. That's where this brokerage is held, actually. So it's easy. I just add my advisor number to the account and we're rocking and rolling. It wouldn't make sense for me to go in, sell all the investments that they already have in this account and put them into my own investment model or strategy if they had investments that were just as good or that covered the same kind of asset class. For example, if they had an S&P 500 fund with Vanguard, but it just so happened to be held at Fidelity, and I used iShares or a Fidelity ETF, it wouldn't necessarily make sense for me to just go in and say, hey, we're going to sell this one, buy this, because that would trigger a taxable event. And if it's a good, high-performing, low-cost S&P 500 index ETF or similar type fund, hey, great, let's just keep that. That will be the substitute that I'll use for what I would have used as the S&P 500. In some situations, they may have investments that are expensive or underperforming or that just don't align with their goals. They don't align with our investment strategy either, in which case we would talk about the tax complexities of this situation. Just to illustrate this more clearly, if we sell everything they have and keep the money invested in the account, they would be on the hook for a $100,000 gain. Now, in this situation, they fell onto that investment for more than 1 year, which is beneficial. So they'll get long-term capital gains tax treatment. And in their situation, it would be taxed at the 15% level federal. Remember, there's no state income tax because they live in Florida, yippee. But if they were living in California on the other side of the coast, then they would face state income tax on that as well. So something to think about if you're going to live in one state and you're retiring to another state. Boy, we want to consider the tax implications before we make the big adjustment. So it's important to have that in here. All that to say, tax efficiency matters. With IRAs, Roth IRAs, HSAs, we can buy and sell as much as we want, generally without any tax consequence, which is nice. So if you've got other investments, great. We can talk about, how we move those over, the efficiency. It's fairly straightforward for moving IRAs around. It's generally not a problem. So pretty easy, just something for you to be aware of. Okay, so here we are. All told, on the investment side, they've got just under $2 million between the HSA, a couple of 401ks, a Roth, and a brokerage account. And don't forget, they've got cash. So right now, their net worth is just over $2 million. They own a home. So we are going to come in here and add the home stuff. They bought it years ago for about $200,000. And now you may or may not be shocked to hear it's worth about $750,000. Annual appreciation, these are the default numbers, and we can adjust those as needed. They pay about $3,500. Actually, excuse me. They pay about $6,500 in property tax. Insurance is not cheap either. They're paying about $4,000 on insurance. And our budget for maintenance, we're planning on about $10,000 a year in estimated maintenance costs that they'll need for the home. I think they need a new roof and probably a new air conditioner is going to go out in the next few years. Who knows about those air conditioners? I mean, sometimes, anyway. So they got the home. They are debt-free. They just paid off their home. So completely debt-free. They're in good shape on that side. If they did have a loan, then we would talk about, are you anxious to pay this off or not? The pros and the cons. There's a financial piece. Then there's just like a values-based piece. Do you want to be debt-free? And what's the most efficient way to do that? It may make sense to, take some money out of the brokerage account. But one common question I get again and again is, should we take money out of the 401k when I retire to pay off the loan? And let me just be very clear here. Almost always the answer is no, especially not all in 1 year. Now, if you had $30,000 or $40,000 left on a mortgage, okay, it's not the end of the world. But if you have $300,000 or $400,000 left on a mortgage, boy, taking that kind of money out of a 401k or IRA in this case would generate an enormous tax liability in that year. And for them, jump them a couple of tax brackets higher than they would be had we just taken some money out over time. Now for them, the brokerage account, the money market, that's going to be a much more tax efficient place to pull the money from had they had a mortgage. But their home's paid off, so they've got options. All right. And that's pretty much it. They don't have a business. It's kind of a simple situation. But if they did have a business, we would add that in here. Partnership interests. If they owned real estate, that was a rental property, something like that. If they had life insurance, like a whole life policy or other permanent life insurance policy with some cash value, we could add that in the mix. There's a lot we can do here, but we're going to move on to section 5, which is living expenses. This is essentially it's not the most fun conversation to have. Okay, I'm just going to come out here and say it. I'll be the first to admit. But I just want to get clear, like in an average month, how much does it cost you to live? For them, like I mentioned, they don't have a mortgage, but they have some housing related expenses that we've accounted for with the property insurance and taxes, things like that. So anything related to the home, we've already accounted for. So separate from that, how much does it cost them to live? For them, it costs them on average about $7,500 or so a month. Okay, we'll save that there. Now there's some wiggle room in that number, by the way, but that was the number they gave. So that's the number we're going to go with. And we're going to adjust that here. Retirement. Okay, perfect. So Cosmo, as we mentioned, is already retired, 66. Wanda is 61. She thinks when she turns 63, she's going to be done. Okay. Healthcare costs. We're going to go on a detailed estimate. Essentially, this is healthcare costs pre-Medicare. So it's not going to apply for Cosmo because he's already on Medicare. But for him, it's going to be based on his adjusted gross income. That's all working in the background here in this financial planning tool that we have. This is what I think is the best of the best when it comes to real financial planning because it's pulling in Social Security, it's pulling in tax calculations. In this case, it's pulling in IRMA, or the income-related monthly adjustment amount connected with Medicare, and for Medicare Part D, which is prescription drug coverage. And then we've also just budgeted out-of-pocket expenses as kind of an estimate from year to year. For Wanda, pre-Medicare, thankfully, she is on a health insurance plan sponsored by her employer. But then when she is no longer employed, she's going to have to go on to the marketplace to cover health insurance costs. We can adjust that number up and down depending on income. For now, we're going to leave it. But once we're clear on exactly the subsidy, if any, that she's going to get after she retires, but before she comes onto Medicare, that's where we make that adjustment. You can see we're really kind of getting the weeds here. This is not like some quick and dirty back of the napkin financial planning. We want to get clear. This is comprehensive. Long-term care planning, kind of the same thing here. Now, normally the way I'll do it is I'll plan for the younger spouse in this scenario to need the long-term care. So in other words, Cosmo, we'll just say in this plan, Cosmo, if he did need some assistance, Wanda would kind of take care of him, the last days, months, years of his life. He'd pass, then Wanda, who's going to be taking care of her. They really do not want to put a financial burden or an emotional burden, for that matter, on their children. She wants to have some financial resources to kind of take care of herself in the event that she needs long-term care. Her mother in this situation and her grandmother both had Alzheimer's. Her mother had early onset Alzheimer's, in fact. So she knows the complexities that are involved there. We're planning on the financial side to make sure things are taken care of, just so that, if and when the need arises, she would be in a good position. So for her, we're planning on actually the last 3 years of the financial plan, and we're going to go in-home care. Now, in-home care in the United States, the national average is about $75,000. Assisted living is not far off that, just a little bit less, about $71,000. But hold on to your socks, because a nursing home average is somewhere between 125 and 130,000. Now, please hear me loud and clear. This varies enormously based on where you're living at the time you need the care and the quality of care that you want. So it can be significantly greater or lower depending on the situation. You know all this, but if you didn't, now you do. So, oops, not nursing home. Let's make that adjustment there. we're going to do assisted living. Okay. All righty. Oh, they have a few other goals. We're going to put in here a car goal. For them, every 6 years, they're going to get a new vehicle. Now, it may not necessarily be new from the dealer, but new for them. And they're planning on about $35,000 or so. And that's going to start for them in probably 2028. That's going to go to the end of the plan. And then every 6 years, they're going to need that. General inflation. Let's talk about this. So with living expenses and other things, we have general inflation in the background. For them, we've targeted 2.5% general inflation. In other words, the cost of living will increase. The cost of these goals will increase. So we're using today's dollars with that in the background. If we want to be more conservative, then we would increase the inflation rate, maybe 3.5, or 4%. I mean, who knows what the Federal Reserve is going to do? Who knows what your elected representatives will do that will have long-term impacts on the economy and all that. For healthcare related costs, we have that as a default at 5%. Now, we want to be extra conservative there, but hey, you look back over healthcare related expenses in the last 2 decades, it's not a far stretch to assume that a 5% increase in healthcare related expenses will continue into the future. They have a vacation goal where they want to go. We call these the go-go years. That's how I like to describe it, at least. So the go-go years is going to be the first 10 years of their retirement. So we're going to say the goal will start in 2028, and it's going to go for 10 years. Now, in reality, when you retire, you're full of energy, you're full of life, you want to go see and do things and visit the grandkids and do all that, which is great. But you get older, at a certain point, things start to slow down. You may not be spending as much money as you had originally thought. And so expenses tend to decrease, generally in your late 70s, 80s. And then towards the end of your life, they start to come back up again with those healthcare related expenses, as we pointed out, with long-term care costs and our estimate there. So for them, we're going to have these go-go years be about $20,000 extra. So it's just a temporary spike in living expenses that will then go away after 10 years. There's other things we could add in here. If they decide to move, maybe they're going to relocate their home to a different state, buy a vacation home so the kids and grandkids can come visit them once a year. Whatever it is, we can add that in here. Oh, one last thing we need to add in, gifting. They donate on a regular basis. They tithe to a church. They give 10% of their income. That is just going to continue. So we have that going until the end of the plan. Now, how most people donate is they give cash, which is not very tax efficient, especially with some of the new changes that have been made from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed not that long ago. With donations, they are a perfect example for donating assets in kind. Remember that brokerage account that they had that had about $150,000 in it? And remember the basis was about a third. Let's go back. I'll show you where it was. It was right here in the net worth section. This brokerage account, remember we talked about this, they bought it for $50,000. Now it's worth $150,000. If they donate, remember there's a lot of investments in here. It's not like one piece of rental property where they got to sell the whole thing. It's all or nothing. No, they've got a bunch of different investments. So we can really fine tune it from a tax planning perspective and save them a lot on taxes. If they donate, let's say they decide to donate $20,000 in a given year to their church, 501c3 organization. In other words, they're tax exempt. We can go in here and we can find the investment that has the greatest amount of gain built into it. I mean, not all they have multiple investments here. They all haven't grown the same amount. We're going to look for the one that's grown the most and that they've held on to for more than 1 year. And we'll donate that investment, assuming we can get the $20,000 out of it, which almost always we can. Then we can transfer that stock to the church, let the church sell it, and the church is no better or worse off, but you are significantly better off because you've now avoided the tax that you would have otherwise had to face on the realization of that income if you were to have sold it. This is great for them. They still want to have this so we can take money out of the money market and reinvest it. We can buy that same investment right back. Not a problem. Very, very tax efficient way to donate. So we're going to come here and we're just going to assume for them, let's go back to the goals section, that they're going to be donating appreciated assets. Now, when they turn 70 and a half, we can start doing qualified charitable distributions from the IRA, which is fantastic, even more tax efficient than donating appreciated assets. Donor advised funds. I could go on and on. There's so many exciting things here. We don't have time. We're going to keep going. A donor advised fund is a great, extremely tax efficient strategy as well. If you donate or you want to help a cause you care deeply about, maybe a scholarship fund, you seriously may want to consider some of these strategies. All right. So now we've got the inputs based in the financial plan. The first place I like to go is to verify some of the data that we've just input together and look at how the cash flows are impacting the success of this plan. So the first thing I want to do is look at the next full year. So in this case, we're looking at 2027. You can see the income. We've got $95,000. You can see a little bit of Social Security is going to turn on for Cosmo when he files. And then we've got some planned distribution. Now, the planned distribution here is the health savings account, the HSA. I like to keep the HSA distributions until a little bit later in life. Now, for most people, I kind of will plan it around 75. Now, it's going to depend on your life expectancy and the health of you and your family. If your health is deteriorating faster than expected, hey, let's pull it out sooner. But if you're still relatively healthy, every year we can wait to take money out of that HSA is a year longer we can enjoy the tax-free compounding growth of the health savings account. And they're investing in it. They've got it aggressively. Let's do it. So for them, we're going to say it's going to start coming out at age 75. So I'm going to save those settings there. We're going to come back to the retirement section and back to the cash flows. And you can see here now that distribution's gone away. And it will start up once he turns 75. Now, this is now going to include a few things here, the IRA and the HSA as part of a reimbursement strategy. But let's go back. We're keeping it simple. So on the left, here you can see the income and a little bit of Social Security turning on when he turns 67 next year in 2027. You can see their living expenses, and we erred on the side of being pretty conservative here. Again, conservative being higher than they originally expect. In fact, the husband thought they were spending something more like $5,000. The wife thought it was maybe $7,000. We took the higher number and we added a little bit extra. We'll adjust that in a minute. Housing related expenses, remember they're completely debt free, but they still got some insurance, HOA, maintenance, property tax, that kind of thing. And then healthcare related expenses there. Taxes, federal income tax, and FICA. FICA tax, that's Medicare and Social Security tax. The FICA tax will go away once she stops working. So if we fast forward and now she's no longer working, you can see it's just the federal income tax that's there right now. Back to 2027. Planned savings, she's putting the money into her 401k, health savings account. Awesome. Now, in this scenario, we can see that the amount of income that she has coming in relative to their living expenses, housing costs, 401k coming out, it doesn't match. In fact, what we're showing is they're having to take about $50,000 out from savings accounts or from somewhere to support this model that we've built. This always happens. It might be under, it might be over, but it always happens in the sense that we need to make adjustments and tweaks. That's part of the process we call financial planning. So we'll come back here to the profile section. Maybe happens in the same meeting, maybe a little bit later, but maybe they realize, it's probably more like $5,500 a month that we're spending now, and that we'll likely spend when we retire. That's probably a more accurate number. They hadn't realized that they were accounting for the mortgage that they'd been paying off aggressively and a few other things. So We'll come back here to the retirement section now that we've got those updates in their financial plan. And we'll come back here to the cash flows. And we can see that, yeah, it's about 30,000 or so, but that's almost the amount that they are planning on saving. And really, this is the money that they've been taking out, a little bit from the brokerage account. And so, there's pros and cons. We would, at this point, talk about, does it make sense to keep going pre-tax on the 401k? Should we go Roth? Are there things we need to do? Where's the money coming from? Remember, he just retired. So cash flows are kind of wonky right now as they're trying to figure things out. So we'll give them a little bit of grace. But what I'm very interested in is what happens when they're actually both retired. So you can see here, he's filed for Social Security. She hasn't filed for it yet. It's just Cosmo's benefit coming on. Living expenses, those have increased a little bit here with inflation. Vacation goal, that's on top of these living expenses, and then federal income tax. Right now in this scenario, we are planning on them needing to take out almost $100,000 to support the standard of living. Where's that $100,000 going to come from? For them, the most efficient place would be a brokerage account first, and then IRA, and then Roth last. Now, there's software that's going to tell me that in a minute. I've done this for long enough. I'll know how it's going to shake out for them in this scenario. But what I'm just now looking at is kind of different projections, looking at cash flows at different years in the future. You can see here, we now have them both filing. They both got Social Security turning on. You can see there's the spousal benefit. Remember, I talked about that before. So this is Wanda's benefit, but she's going to get extra because she's not 50% of Cosmo's when she files at her full retirement age. But you can see here, we've got distributions coming out when Cosmo is 80 and she is 75, which means they've hit the required minimum distribution age, RMD age. This is when the government starts to force you to take money out of your retirement accounts, regardless if you need it or not. Now, for them, those distributions they're going to need because, that's an abnormal year because it's a car year, but let's just go back 1 year so you can see this. You can see that here's their living expenses, housing, healthcare costs, taxes that are being paid on that distribution. And in this scenario, they actually have excess money left over, about $27,000 they did not need, but was in fact forced out of their IRA and 401k because of required minimum distributions. Notice something else. The federal tax, $12,000 is what we're projecting. And I recognize there's a lot of assumptions in financial planning. I'll be the first to admit. But assuming the tax law, stays the same as it is today, which is a big assumption for the next few decades. Assuming it stays the same, that's what we can expect their federal income tax liability to be. Notice if we go back to when Cosmo was 74, she was 69, Wanda was. Federal tax payment was $23,000 in that scenario. Interesting. Let's go back even further. Taxes is $5,000. So there's a faster way to look at all this, by the way. I'll show you that here. We're going to go to the summary section. This shows you year by year across the board. So you can see what's going on here. We can see income. We can see retirement. We can see Social Security turning on. I'll show it so you can break it out. I think this is fun, but maybe that's the nerdy side of me. You can see the cash flows turning on, when they're turning on. I just did 67 at full retirement age for both of them. That's not what we're going to do, by the way. One is going to file for full retirement age. That would be Cosmo. One is actually going to file a little bit sooner. I'll show you why in another episode, maybe. And living expenses, goals, you can see all that broken out here. Look at taxes. This is what I want to point your attention to. Notice how taxes drop significantly in these 2 years. That's because they've got those excess cash reserves. Now, I like to keep, for most retirees, about 6 months of liquid cash or cash equivalents on hand. I found a lot of people don't know what a cash equivalent is. This would be money markets, high yield savings accounts, short-term U.S. treasuries. That's probably one of my favorite places to keep, short-term cash equivalents. And then from an investment and income standpoint, I like to have somewhere between 2 to 3 years worth of income needs covered by fixed income investments. That might be bond ETFs, private credit, things like that, that are going to provide fixed cash flow. We know what it's going to be. It's predictable. We're not having to guess on big, wild fluctuations in asset prices. And then we would, have a discussion around the other investments growing, keeping pace with inflation, stocks, private equity, maybe other alternative investments, things like that. Okay. For them, low tax years here, we get a spike here, but that's for the car purchase. And just remember, we're going to smooth that out. Okay. It's not like we're going to spike them up in that year that they need a car here in 2034. And that's going to correlate with a big spike in their federal income tax liability because they're pulling money from IRAs, which are all taxable. So we smooth that out ahead of time. But just kind of looking at how things are growing into the future. Okay. We can see here that at 90 years old in the year 2050, Cosmo's passed in this financial plan. So it's just Wanda, and she is now a single tax filer. You can see that we get a little bit of a jump there from a tax perspective. By the way, we have expenses dropping off. I think it's either 70 or 80% of normal. So, if you're married and your expenses are, let's say, 100,000 at that point, one spouse passes away, generally expenses remain kind of sticky. Even if you're just a single person, you don't get remarried, oftentimes it's still about 70 to 80% of what you were spending when it was the two of you. So we've got that modeled in here, but notice the taxes jump and then they drop a little bit those last few years of life. Okay. Roth conversions will help this, especially in these early years here where income is low. I mean, it's almost a no-brainer in 2028, 2029, 2030. I could probably even make a case for the next few years where it might make sense to start moving some of this pre-tax money that they've got here, this pre-tax, or what we sometimes call tax deferred, that's the 401k and IRA, to the Roth bucket, which has relatively little. You can see tax deferred for them, just over 80, almost 82% of it, all their investments. Tax-free is about 5.5%. I'd like to see that increase. Now, again, the goal is not to get everything from tax deferred to tax-free. That never was, never is the goal. The goal is to reduce the tax exposure, the tax liability that they have over the course of their lifetime. And there's a number of tools we use to analyze that. Effective tax rate is one. You can see we have this valley down here. That's a great time to consider Roth conversions. We can look at capital gains brackets for them. Doesn't matter as much. I know it looks really spiky here, but they're in the 0% bracket for a while there. And then we could start to model or calibrate how much we're doing as Roth conversions. It's one of my favorite sections. So we can come in here and you can see, all right, we're filling up this bracket. Should we go to the next bracket? How much do we convert? When do we convert? Does it improve the success of the financial plan overall? Let's just show them filling up the 12% bracket. Over time, we can talk about, does it make sense to do? Does it not? What are the pros and the cons of doing conversions at that level? We can test different scenarios. For them, if we just do small conversions and we fill up the 10% tax bracket, they're better off by about $44,000, which is pretty powerful. And that's kind of a no-brainer. And that's an easy one. We're just doing a little bit of Roth conversions. You can see that dark green shaded area that represents the Roth conversion compared with the blue, which is if they do nothing. So that's kind of a no-brainer. That's easy. I can massage some of these numbers to make these look better or worse, by the way. Let's just be clear. This, at the end of the day, financial plan is a guess. But the more confident we can be in our assumptions and what you want life to look like, then the better decisions we can make today. And really, financial planning, I think, is putting yourself in the best possible position so that whatever life throws at you, you can handle it. You can bob and weave. You can be tax efficient and adjust where you're pulling money from. If all of a sudden we see tax rates spike maybe just for a few number of years, we may shift. We may start taking more money out of the Roth bucket because it's tax-free. And then if taxes come back down, then we may shift and start taking more money out of pre-tax or traditional retirement accounts like an IRA. The whole point is we want to be in a strong position to not be forced one way or the other out of our will. That's really what I think financial planning helps you to see. Wow, I've got some risks and I want to mitigate those risks as much as possible and take advantage of opportunities as they come. Now, the big question for them, and there's so many other things we're going to talk about, but trying to keep this brief, relatively speaking, can they do it? Is this financial plan successful? Can they retire, live the life they want to live, make it both of them until 90? What does that look like? For them, about a 74% probability of success. That is to say, in thousands of scenarios that the software tool has modeled, 74% of them have given their blessing, their stamp of approval. In other words, they're not going to have to change their standard of living. They're not going to run out of money, is one way you could look at it, if they both make it till 90. This is arguably where the husband comes in and says, well, shoot, I'm not going to live till 90. I'm probably going to make it to 80 or shoot, maybe even 85 if the stars align, but no way am I going to make it to 90. And if I do make it to 90, well, I'm going to go for a long drive in the canyon and, something like that. And that may or may not be you. You probably know somebody who sounds like that at a minimum. Okay, fine. Let's come in here. Let's make some adjustments. Let's say that in reality, you're not living that long. What does the financial plan look like at that point? So we can come here and I'll start to add some of these in. And we are going to now make some adjustments. So we're going to keep Wanda at 90, but maybe Cosmo says, hey, it's just going to be 85 that we're going to be living there. You can see it doesn't really make that much of a difference in the success of the financial plan. But I'll tell you what does. Living expenses. Let's say that it's not actually $5,500, but it's more like $5,000 a month is how much they need to live on. What does that do to the plan? It increases it. It brings it up from 74% to 82%. What happens if their investments change or they delay taking Social Security or long-term care? We start to make adjustments. What if Wanda saves a little bit more in the 401k plan or saves a little bit less? And we can start to get the plan to a higher and higher probability. I like to see success rates north of 85%. They're pretty close. Roth conversions will probably put them over the edge because of the tax savings compounding over time. That would be one thing. They're a little too conservative, I think, from an investment standpoint. So I think there are some other investments we could put in that would add just slightly more risk, but enormous amount of return relative to where they're currently standing. And so it's little tiny tweaks like this that would help them. Right now, we've got in a pro rata distribution. In other words, when they do retire, they're taking a little bit from all the various accounts. But if I go in and model that taxable distribution first, then the pre-tax second, and Roth third, that's going to improve the success of the plan. So it's all these little things that are going to get us there. And I'll tell you, it's no one size fits all. Financial planning is different for everybody. But once we are confident in the financial plan that we've created together, now we can start to talk about how are we going to invest? How much money do you need to take? And which investments are we going to sell to get you there? And that's where me and my team get involved to do the heavy lifting on actually implementing the plan, executing on the strategies, making sure that any tax decisions we make are communicated well in advance to your tax preparer. That's when we bring in an estate planning attorney and make sure that the right investments are being inherited or going to the trust in an efficient way. Anyway, give you just a little taste of what financial planning is. My name is Rizek. I'm a financial advisor. If you enjoyed this, be sure to like and follow for more.